Hi, and welcome to the Design Find podcast, a space where women are interviewed and in conversation to discuss the highs, lows, and everything in between about being a woman in design. The Design Find has new episodes every Monday, so make sure you come back every week. You can find more on the Design Find podcast Instagram. Hope you enjoy this episode. Hi, and welcome to the Design Find the podcast. Today we have Ninnie, so welcome, Ninnie.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So to start, can you just tell the listeners a little bit about yourself, a little introduction?
Okay, so my background is in architecture and design, but I work quite across the board in terms of the field of interior design and also in what we call user experience design. So that involves the narrative and the storytelling involved with, for example, digital spaces that are perhaps online, or the interface that exists between our real world and our digital world.
So where did you study? Where do you live? Just kind of a broader context of who you are as an architect.
Grew up in Sweden, and that's sort of where I would say my architecture journey started. I would say started already when I was quite young and maybe first or second grade. I used to spend my evenings doing ceramics. And in particular, I would always build these clay houses. And I would spend my evenings building these clay houses as a child. And that's how somehow I started getting into the idea of not just architecture, but what does it mean when we're creating spaces? And what are these containers that we call houses and homes? And what is the sort of the stories and the narratives that are involved in creating those spaces? So I would imagine each and every house that I built out of clay, what would go on inside and what would be the context of where this house would be. So that's really where my initial spark for architecture was born, because I felt it was almost as if I got to be like a little creator, creating my own reality through that medium, and I could affect or create some kind of imaginary world and change within that little world, because all of a sudden I had a village of these houses. So, and then I grew up and it was time to go to university. And I wasn't quite clear at first where I would study or quite what I would do, creating all these little clay houses. And then with time, as I became a teenager, I had an entire village of these clay houses. And it just dawned on me when I was there at the point when I was about 18 years old and I was about to choose a subject to study. It just struck me, it has to be architecture. Architecture it's what I do. It's what makes sense to me, how I wanted to affect or change or create change in this world. I could really see architecture have a real impact on people. So I took that original idea that I had already as a child and brought that with me through my studies. And what I would find is throughout my studies, I would quite often use clay as a medium to create models. So I would model in clay. So where I would perhaps in uni see my peers use cardboard and the balsa wood and plastics and that kind of material, I often found that the pliability of clay was something that I really took to and would use that as a medium. And that just grew into the work that I do later on, which is quite interesting. It just started so early on. So that's my sort of background, where it all came from. And
Great.
then
Cool story. I love how it started with arts and crafts and being a kid, and you kind of just made that into your career. So right now, what do you do as an architect? Do you work as an architect, or you mentioned interior design previously? Just kind of currently, what are you doing and what do you do in that field?
Okay. So I am not a traditional architect in the sense that I only work with a specific type of building or a specific type of setting. What I do is I create spaces and a narrative that are centered around the user. And it's almost as if it's a juxtaposition between the art and the imaginary, and that is the real, the inhabited spaces. So I'm existing more within sort of an interdisciplinary setting, taking into account like new technologies, the imaginary and the storytelling, and the real. So I've done everything from art directing and creating sets for music videos to also drawing a house quite recently. So I drew up a private villa for a client, taking inspiration again from clay, and using that in the narrative of creating a space that felt as if it was carved out of the landscape. And all the different areas and the zones of the house would unfold and open, so blurring the line between what's inside and outside, and what is perhaps a void, and also what is man-made and human created and what's natural. So I'm playing a lot with these material and elements in what I do.
So what are
So my
some of the
practice is quite
coolest-
wide.
So what are some of the coolest projects you've worked on?
Some of the coolest. I will let you decide that. But for me, in terms of what I derive the most joy and pleasure from doing, let's just take this private house. It was incredibly challenging because of it was quite a challenging project because of the site and the position where I was in. And it was a lot smaller scale than what I worked on before, working on bigger commercial projects, let's say hotels or big residential projects while working in a practice. But there was something incredibly beautiful with creating intimate spaces. So when you create an intimate space and you have this beautiful relationship with this one client, there is something magical that happens because you realize that it's an act of co-creation. And I thought that was incredible. And it was much more direct and immediate than what you say, something that is just created for someone that you don't really know. When you know who the user is, and there's someone that is clearly going to be experiencing this journey, it creates almost as if that character or that person influences the project. So I thought that was incredibly cool. Much more cool, I would say, than perhaps many other projects that I worked that have been worked on that have been global on a massive scale, because the impact that you see and the ability to create details, they don't get watered down or sort of end up lost on a desk somewhere, because that can perhaps happen when you're on a really big project and you have different type of time constraints, and the way that you value or that you plan out your resources, the time and quality, it takes a different type of dynamic than perhaps when you're working, for example, in that case with a client, and it's so much more detail focused. You're building something more from the bottom up rather than top down. And I thought that was incredibly cool because it was the first time that I've actually specifically drawn a house for someone, a private client. So that was incredible.
So you mentioned that you've done interior design and architecture. Which one do you prefer, or if you don't prefer one particularly, what are some pros and cons of each one if people are looking to go into either industry?
I would say that there is not a hard line between architecture and interior design. There's not a hard line. I would start by asking, not just looking at, oh, I like that type of architecture or I like that type of interior design, and just look on the surface level of things. Instead, I think if you start with a deeper inquiry, asking yourself, why do you want to do something and what kind of impact do you want to have? You can do amazing things doing either or. But if you just start with that one question, like, why do you want to do something and what impact do you want to have? That could be the start of understanding more deeply who you are and what you want to do. And in my case, if I just relate that back to where I started and how I think about this, if you create a space for someone to enjoy, sometimes you might think of architecture as being like the exterior outside container, and the interior being perhaps the softer elements, the more tactile objects that you touch. But that interface is somehow not so direct and distinct. And if you're not sure, you just have to go and play around. I would say start with just playing around with the ideas of imagining either or. If you're from the perspective of, I don't know what I want to study perspective, I would say play around with either or and then ask that deeper question.
So
And what do you enjoy?
What do you enjoy?
Yeah, what do you enjoy? I enjoy the stories of objects and the symbols of them when we look at if we look at the small scale. So interior is often to do with the smaller scale. So the intimacy of the objects and the pleasure that you can get from it. It can be something as simple as the setting of where you have your cup of tea in the morning or your coffee. What do you experience? What do you see? How does it feel? What surfaces and materials and textures do you experience? And then that's on one level, but then on another level, there is that idea, and that's, I think, more connected to why I intentionally chose architecture. And that was the ability to create and affect change in the world by inspiring people, and to feel joy and connected not only to the nature and the community that surround us, but also finding that playfulness and joy and connection. And you can do that through architecture. Sometimes people don't really realize how much buildings and infrastructure, structure, and town planning affects us. But it's literally the way that you move through a city, where you go and how you feel, is all woven into the fabric of the city. And the architecture and the buildings are sort of like the interface of the skin that symbolizes that in our built world around us.
So what is your style in terms of architecture or interior design?
This is a good one. This is a really good question. I've asked myself that quite a few times before, like how would I define my style, or why do I do what I do? And it all, at the end of the day, I would say it's not really the style. The style comes from the feeling of wanting to play and discover, and a sense of curiosity. Quite often we talk about style as, oh, that's minimalism, or that's kind of like something more traditional, or is this, that, and the other. But I think the style to be just about what's on the surface, but it's about also the underlying functions of how you use the space, or how you create something, and also the intention behind it. And for me, it has to have a playfulness, but it also has there's an underlying, I would say it's a little bit witty, because if you look in between of how things are created at the junctions, you can see that there's sometimes a juxtapositioning or a contrast that creates a new meaning. It's almost as if spaces are curated by being put together, like pieces of art or objects.
What is something that people don't know about you? And this can be like personal or in terms of architecture and interior design.
I think perhaps people know a little bit about this, but it's not something that I talk quite a lot about, perhaps in my professional work. But I am quite deeply into yoga, and I'm also and yoga and meditation, and then there's the other side of me, which is quite interesting. It's that I'm quite into Taekwondo as well. I was raised in a family of Taekwondo. So my father, he's a grandmaster of Taekwondo. And I think those two aspects, although they're on surface of things, one might seem like this meditative calm person, and the other one, this kind of fighting spirit that you find in Taekwondo. There is an element of discipline and rigor that I perhaps got from one, and a softness and flexibility and calmness of the other that I have through my life as a constant learner somehow woven into my practice as an architect and a designer as well. And I think that's something perhaps people don't really know about me.
That was really cool. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
What is something you want to see more of in your design field?
I would like to see more of I would like to see a deeper understanding of the sort of the deeper understanding and a deeper questioning about why we're doing certain things. And I'm relating this to what I see in the world today regarding not just the climate crisis, but asking sustainability questions, environmental, eco-friendliness, not just about choosing materials that seem eco-friendly or environmentally sound, but how do these materials or the way that we construct things function long term? Because to me, what I see, there is quite a lot of what we call sometimes greenwashing going on. On the surface of things, it seems good, but what are the underlying functions? It's not as simple as to the way that we organize and structure spaces in society. And those fundamental building blocks, it starts with the narrative that are happening within, like what is going on in our collective consciousness, in our personal minds as we're creating. Because as an architect or designer, you have an incredible opportunity and also a power to influence society. So just being aware or having an awareness of why we're doing things, and sometimes taking a moment to stop and think. So when it comes down to what we saw during the COVID pandemic, if we're looking at that and we're taking that as a case study, what we'll find and what we'll see is some incredible lessons learned as well, with in terms of what happens when we as a society start slowing down, because it gave nature an opportunity to regenerate. So what we sometimes might think is that as humans, we're here and we have to save the world and we have to change things and we have to act now and do this and do that. There is an element, of course, of acting, and we need to get things done and sort things out. But there is also an element of slowing down and asking ourselves, should we really do this? Or what happens when we're actually giving space and backing off? So that's something I think we should reflect on.
I think that was a great positive of the pandemic, and I'm sure you can really see that in people trying to become more environmental.
Yes, I see that happening. I do think we have quite a distance to go. But I'm just now myself, I'm trying to structure or create some kind of framework or structure for how I should potentially be more potentially create an intentionality and also influence my peers in some kind of meaningful way with regards to this.
What is the most underrated part about being a designer?
It's a really good question. It's one that I haven't really reflected much upon. I don't know if there is one that comes to mind other than I would say if we just lump all designers into one tribe together, what you'll find is on average, this tribe is very open-minded, curious and inquisitive, and quite driven to ask questions and create change for the future. I think that's the one thing that perhaps people don't think about, but it's a very open community of people who are not generally not afraid of asking questions, but they've also been quite preoccupied with creating things. So just finding that balance, I would say that's quite underrated. We don't think about that, but as a collective, yeah, it's quite a nice community and supportive. It's incredibly supportive community as well.
What is your best words of wisdom or advice for someone looking to become an architect or interior designer?
I would say finding something that can anchor you in your private life, or if you take it into the context of yourself, into your body, because I can see that if you're quite driven and you're sitting a lot at your desk and you're creating things, you might end up quite a lot in your head, in your intellectual thoughts, creating within your head, and you might spend a lot of time doing that. So I would say it's incredibly important to have something that's anchoring you in your body, if that is some kind of movement practice, sport, or doing something other than just sitting at the desk. Because what you will find if you're choosing to study architecture or design, or perhaps interior as well, the schools tend to be open 24 hours. We are given swipe cards to go. And I would find that my friends who were studying medicine, I mean, the school eventually closes. There might be a library they can go to study, but architecture school tend to never close. So that's something to keep in mind, that just don't get stuck too much in your head, because it being project-based, it's an ongoing thing. It becomes like your little baby. You don't really want to stop working on it if you love it so much. But you need to find a boundary for yourself. You need to find something that is planned into your schedule that you go and do that's not that, because that again will inspire you and influence that later on. But don't get too lost in thoughts and stuck in your head creating, because it is really fun.
What's your favorite part about being an architect?
I get to imagine a future or a different world. I get to create spaces that hopefully inspire others. And during that process, it's also enabled me to travel quite a lot in my work and to meet a lot of beautiful people, both working with them and while doing research. And I think it's been an incredible journey for me, as well as a human being, just learning. Because what you realize when you're doing this in particular is you have to put yourself in a learner's in the mindset of that you're a constant learner, because no one project is alike. So it's incredibly important to have that kind of attitude and open mindset. And it's something that for me was not so easy when I started off doing this in my early teens, because I noticed that it could be quite challenging. But as I've gone along in the process, you just come to accept the process as it is, and having an open mind, and just like feeling more and more as if you're a free spirit here, just to create and imagine things and see where that takes you.
So lastly, what do you want to be known for?
If you've asked me when I was 18 years old, before I embarked on the journey, I had dreams and visions of creating really great pieces of architecture, preferably really big and impactful and large scale. But as I have myself gone through this process and this journey, I've come to realize that it's more about creating change that's happening for people. So it's not so much about the initial just the wow factor, but it's about how can I sustain that and create that interface that people connect with, and that one that makes them want to return to that space, but take that little bit back with them after they visited a place. So if they can take that feeling that they've experienced back with them as a memory or as an imprint, then I feel I have been successful, because that is like a ripple effect, right? So that can then, like a ripple, create change throughout
Well, thank you so
society.
much for sharing with us your story. Can you tell the listeners where they can find you? So if you've a LinkedIn, an Instagram, a website, anything like that?
Yeah, sure. I've got a website. It's currently under construction. It's ninnieyeo.com. And you can find me on LinkedIn. There's only one person with my name, and that's Ninnie Yeo. Other than that, yes, I'm active on Instagram. So it's at Ninnie Yeo. That's NINNIEYEO.
Great. Thank you so
So
much.
just thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Hey, I hope you loved this episode. If you did, rate and review on Apple Podcast and Spotify, or send it to people who you would think would be interested in listening in. You can learn more about the guests in the show notes or on the Design Find Instagram. The Design Find podcast is under the Entrepreneurs Network.